At Riverside Academy, power is everything. And for Jordan Carter, the new kid, the outsider, it's clear from day one that he doesn't belong. But what the school doesn't know: Jordan isn't just any new kid, he's a fighter. When the school's golden boy, Brandon Hale, tries to break him, Jordan stands his ground. And what happens next? No one sees it coming. This isn't just a battle for respect, it's a war for survival. Welcome to H2 Black Thread, where we uncover the stories of those fighting for the respect they deserve. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest videos, because the truth deserves to be told. The rain had stopped just in time for Jordan Carter to step out of the taxi. He glanced up at the towering iron gates of Riverside Academy, the prestigious boarding school that was supposed to be his new home. The words discipline, honor, excellence were engraved into the stone archway above the entrance. Jordan exhaled slowly, shifting the weight of his duffel bag on his shoulder. His mother had convinced him that this transfer was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but to him, it just felt like another battlefield. He had transferred before. Many times. He had learned that no matter where he went, the first day was always the same: judgmental glances, hushed whispers, and a silent expectation for him to either fail or lash out. This time would be no different. As Jordan walked across the courtyard, students glanced at him, some subtle, others less so. A few whispered behind their hands, their eyes scanning him like an anomaly they weren't sure belonged. Jordan had seen it before, the way people stared at the new black kid in a school where most faces were rich, white, and well-connected. He ignored them and kept walking toward the main entrance. Inside, the school hallways smelled of polished wood, expensive books, and authority. Portraits of old white men, former headmasters, most likely, lined the walls, their stern faces staring down at him like they, too, were judging his presence. He tightened his grip on his bag. A woman in a gray blazer approached him with a smile too polished to be genuine. "You must be Jordan Carter," she said, scanning him quickly before glancing at her clipboard. "I'm Mrs. Whitmore, head of student affairs." "Welcome to Riverside Academy." Jordan forced a polite nod. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll have one of our prefects show you to your dorm," she continued, motioning to a tall student standing nearby. Jordan turned to find himself looking at a well-dressed, blonde-haired guy with a crisp school blazer. His perfectly styled appearance screamed wealth and legacy. "This is Brandon Hale," Mrs. Whitmore introduced. "He's one of our top students and team captain of the football team." Brandon flashed a perfect, practiced smile. "Welcome to Riverside, Carter," he said smoothly, but his eyes held something else, not quite hostility, but something close. Jordan had seen this type before: the golden boy, the untouchable one, the one who set the rules. And judging by Brandon's calculating gaze, Jordan had already broken an unspoken rule just by existing. Brandon walked ahead, leading Jordan down the hallway toward the dormitory wing. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Jordan could feel Brandon assessing him, but he refused to give him anything to work with. Finally, Brandon broke the silence. "So what brings you to Riverside, Carter?" Jordan shrugged. "My mom thought it was a good school," Brandon smirked. "I'm sure she did." There was something about his tone, not quite insulting but dismissive. They stopped at a door marked Dorm 3B. Brandon leaned against the doorway, crossing his arms. "A little advice, Carter." Jordan turned, meeting his gaze. "You're new here, so you might not get how things work," Brandon said, his tone still light, almost friendly. "Some people fit in, some people don't." Jordan tilted his head slightly. "And which one am I?" Brandon chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess we'll find out." Without another word, he turned and walked away. Jordan watched him go, his karate instincts already recognizing what had just happened. This wasn't a welcome. It was a warning. Jordan sighed and pushed open the door to his new dorm. Inside, his roommate was already unpacked, a skinny white kid with glasses and messy brown hair. He looked up from his laptop, eyes widening slightly when he saw Jordan. "Oh, hey." Jordan dropped his bag on the bed. "Hey." An awkward silence stretched between them before the kid cleared his throat. "I'm Ethan. I guess we're roommates." Jordan nodded. "Looks like it." Ethan hesitated. So where are you from?" Jordan exhaled, already tired of this conversation before it even started. "All over." Ethan blinked. "Oh, cool." More silence. Jordan turned away, deciding that he had done enough socializing for one day. By lunchtime, Jordan could feel the weight of everyone's stares even more. He walked into the massive cafeteria, scanning for a place to sit. Most tables were already full, groups locked in conversations that had no space for outsiders. He had been here before. Finally, he spotted an empty seat near a guy who seemed too busy scrolling through his phone to care. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. He barely set his tray down when a voice cut through the noise. "You lost." Jordan turned. Brandon was sitting at a nearby table, leaning back in his chair, watching him with an amused smirk. A few others at the table were looking at Jordan too, their eyes filled with curiosity and something else, expectation. Jordan exhaled slowly. "Didn't know I needed a map." Brandon chuckled, shaking his head. "Just making sure, not a lot of new faces around here." Jordan caught the hesitation in his voice, the unspoken part of that sentence. Not a lot of black faces around here. He met Brandon's gaze evenly. "Guess I'm the exception." The smirk on Brandon's face twitched slightly, like he hadn't expected Jordan to push back. For a moment, there was silence. Then Brandon smiled again, but it was different this time, sharper. "Welcome to Riverside, Carter." Jordan didn't respond. He just sat down and picked up his fork. The message was clear. This was just the beginning. Jordan knew that the first day was always the easiest. The real test would come later. Brandon and his crew weren't just welcoming him. They were studying him. They were deciding if he was prey or a threat. Jordan had been underestimated before, and he knew one thing for sure: they had no idea who they were dealing with. Jordan had been at Riverside Academy for just 2 days, but he already understood how things worked. This school wasn't just about academics or sports. It was about power, and the people who had it. It was clear that Brandon Hale sat at the top. He wasn't just the football captain or some spoiled rich kid. He ran the school, not officially, but in the way that mattered. People followed him. Teachers favored him. And those who didn't, they stayed out of his way. Jordan could feel it in the hallways, the way students moved aside for Brandon and his crew, the way his name carried weight in every conversation. He had seen this type of unofficial hierarchy before, but at Riverside, it was more than just popularity. It was a system. The first real sign of trouble came on Wednesday morning. Jordan walked into the locker room for gym class, only to find his locker slightly open. Frowning, he pulled it open the rest of the way. His gym shirt and shorts were gone. In their place, a ripped-up old uniform that smelled like mold. Laughter echoed behind him. He turned slowly to see a few guys from Brandon's group watching him, smirking. Nick Saunders, a stocky kid with a square jaw, leaned against a locker. "Looks like someone's got the wrong gear." Jordan's fingers twitched, but he kept his face calm. He could already hear his karate instructor's voice in his head. "Control the moment. Control the fight. Control yourself." Brandon wasn't here. But this had his fingerprints all over it. Jordan didn't react. He simply grabbed the musty old shirt, stuffed it back in the locker, and walked past the group like he didn't care. Nick called after him. "You gonna cry to a teacher, new guy?" Jordan didn't look back. But in his mind, he was already keeping track. Later that day, as Jordan walked down the hallway toward his next class, someone caught up to him. It was Ethan, his roommate. The skinny kid looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "Hey, just a heads up. You're on their radar now." Jordan didn't break stride. "Whose radar?" Ethan lowered his voice. "The Shadow Council." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like something out of a bad movie." Ethan wasn't laughing. "That's what people call them," he muttered. "Brandon and his crew. They decide how things work around here." Jordan stopped walking. "And what exactly have I done to piss off the council?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "You exist." Jordan stared at him. "That bad, huh?" Ethan nodded. "Look, man, I've seen it happen before. New guy shows up, doesn't know his place, and—" Jordan cut him off. "His place?" Ethan hesitated. "I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying it's how it is." Jordan studied Ethan for a second. He wasn't part of the problem, but he wasn't going to stand up to it either. Jordan sighed, shaking his head. "Thanks for the warning." But in his mind, he was done playing by their rules. Lunchtime was another test. Jordan walked into the cafeteria, grabbed a tray, and started scanning for an open seat. He noticed the same thing as the first day: certain tables belonged to certain groups. Athletes at one table, debate team at another, rich kids in the center, and then there was Brandon's table. Jordan saw Nick, Kyle, and a few other guys sitting with Brandon, all laughing about something. Brandon caught Jordan's eye and smirked. Then he gestured to the empty seat across from him. An invitation, but not a friendly one. Jordan knew exactly what this was: a test. If he sat down, it would be under their terms. If he ignored them, he'd be making an enemy. Jordan took a slow breath. Then, instead of walking toward them, he grabbed a chair from another table and dragged it over, right next to Brandon. The table went silent. Jordan dropped his tray, sat down, and looked at Brandon like he wasn't impressed. "You called?" A flicker of something crossed Brandon's face. Annoyance, interest, maybe both. Nick shifted uncomfortably, but Brandon chuckled. "Confident, huh?" Jordan picked up his fork, stabbed a piece of chicken, and took a bite. "Just hungry." Brandon leaned back in his chair, studying him. "All right, Carter, let's make one thing clear." His tone was still casual, but his words carried weight. "There's a way things work around here." Jordan swallowed his bite of food. "And I assume you make the rules." Brandon's smirk widened. "Exactly." Jordan wiped his mouth with a napkin. "Sounds exhausting." Nick and the others shifted in their seats. Brandon's expression didn't change, but Jordan saw it, the tiny crack in his confidence. He wasn't used to people talking back. Brandon slowly leaned forward. "Let me give you some advice, Carter." Jordan met his eyes. "Let me guess, know your place?" Brandon's smirk finally faded. For the first time, he looked irritated. Jordan had passed the test, but he had also just made an enemy. After lunch, Jordan went to his next class, but the atmosphere had changed. He could feel the stares, the whispers. People weren't just watching anymore, they were waiting. Brandon might have smiled in the cafeteria, but Jordan had challenged him, and people like Brandon didn't let things go. Jordan sighed. He hadn't come here looking for a fight, but if it was coming anyway, he would be ready. By the end of his first week at Riverside Academy, Jordan Carter knew one thing for certain: Brandon Hale wasn't done with him. The cafeteria incident had made that clear. Jordan had challenged him publicly and walked away without playing by his rules. That wasn't something someone like Brandon forgot or forgave. For the past 2 days, nothing had happened. No direct confrontations, no blatant insults, no cheap shots in the hallways, but Jordan could feel it coming. It wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. And then, on Friday after gym class, it happened. The moment Jordan stepped into the locker room, he knew something was off. The usual buzz of conversation was quieter. A few guys were watching him too closely. Nick and Kyle, two of Brandon's closest friends, were already changed and lingering near the exit. Jordan's karate instincts kicked in. Something was about to go down, but he didn't react. He walked to his locker, keeping his shoulders relaxed, his breathing steady. Never let them see you tense. Never show them you expect a fight. He unzipped his gym bag and reached for his clothes. That's when he heard the door lock. Jordan's fingers froze. Slowly he turned. The exit door was now shut and locked from the outside. Brandon was standing in front of it, twirling the key around his finger. And he wasn't alone. Nick, Kyle, two other guys Jordan hadn't met yet. They spread out just enough to make movement harder. Jordan exhaled slowly. He had been in situations like this before. 5-on-1 wasn't a fight. It was a message. Brandon leaned against the door casual, like this was all a joke. "So, Carter," he tossed the key in the air and caught it. "We never finished our talk the other day." Jordan rolled his shoulders, staying loose. "You mean the one where you tried to put me in my place and it didn't work?" Nick snorted, shaking his head. "This dude, man, he's got jokes." Brandon smiled, but his eyes weren't amused. "Here's the thing, Carter, this school, it runs on order and I don't like disorder." Jordan shrugged. "Sounds like a personal problem." Brandon took a step forward. "No, it's your problem." Nick was the first to act. It was predictable. He lunged fast but sloppy. Jordan sidestepped, using Nick's momentum against him. Nick stumbled forward, crashing into a locker. The metal clanged loudly. Jordan stayed calm, focused. The first attack had been a test. Brandon's face remained neutral. Kyle went next, a quick swing toward Jordan's ribs. Too wide, too obvious. Jordan blocked effortlessly, gripping Kyle's wrist and twisting. Kyle yelped and dropped to one knee. Jordan let him go and stepped back. "Are we done?" Brandon tilted his head, studying him. Then he smirked. "Not bad, Carter." Jordan didn't like that smirk. It meant Brandon wasn't finished. Before Jordan could react, Brandon moved. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't even try to fight. He kicked Jordan's gym bag across the floor. Its contents, his clothes, his notebook, and his phone, spilled out. Jordan's eyes flicked to them for just a second. That was all it took. Nick moved behind him and shoved him, hard. Jordan stumbled forward. Kyle, still recovering, grabbed his ankle and yanked. Jordan's back hit the locker. The cold metal bit into his spine. Before he could stand, Brandon was there. Fist raised, Jordan's mind went blank. Instinct took over. A block, a counter, a takedown. But then he stopped. Because in that split second, he realized something. Brandon wasn't expecting a fair fight. He was expecting Jordan to react, to throw a punch, to lose control, to prove that he was exactly what Brandon wanted him to be. Jordan breathed in. Then, instead of blocking, he ducked. Brandon's fist slammed into the locker instead of Jordan's face. A sharp clang echoed through the room. Brandon cursed, shaking his fist. Jordan stood up slowly. Brandon's smirk was gone. For the first time, he looked unsure. Jordan dusted off his shirt. "That all you got?" Brandon's expression darkened. "You got lucky." Jordan tilted his head. "Did I?" For a moment, the room was silent. Then Brandon tossed the key at Nick. "Let's go." Nick hesitated. "But now?" Brandon's voice was cold. Kyle picked himself up and the group slowly backed off. Nick unlocked the door and one by one they walked out. Jordan waited until the door shut. Then he exhaled. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from holding back. He could have ended that fight, but if he had, he wouldn't have won. Brandon was looking for an excuse. Jordan hadn't given him one. And that was a bigger victory than any punch. Jordan collected his things. His phone screen was cracked but still working. His notebook was crumpled but readable. He closed his locker and walked out of the gym. Outside, Ethan was waiting. "Dude," he he whispered. What happened in there? Jordan adjusted his backpack. Nothing, he said. Ethan frowned. It doesn't look like nothing. Jordan didn't respond, he just kept walking. By the time Jordan Carter left the locker room, the school day was almost over. The cold autumn air hit his face as he stepped outside, the golden sun casting long shadows across the pavement. He had made it through the week. A long, exhausting, frustrating week of dealing with the unspoken war that Brandon Hale had started. Jordan exhaled, rolling his shoulders to ease the tension. He should have been relieved, but something didn't feel right. His instincts were screaming at him. As he made his way across the nearly empty parking lot, Jordan felt the shift in atmosphere. The usual background noise of students chatting and leaving for the weekend was oddly quiet. A few scattered students were still hanging around, but they were watching. Something was about to happen. Jordan spotted his bike near the far end of the lot, and standing right next to it, Brandon Hale, flanked by Nick, Kyle, and two other guys. Jordan's steps slowed. He had known this was coming. It was never over after just one confrontation, but he had hoped that Brandon would be smarter than this. Clearly, he wasn't. Brandon smirked, arms crossed as Jordan approached. "Leaving so soon, Carter?" Jordan kept walking, calm. "Controlled. If you're here to talk, make it quick." Nick chuckled, cracking his knuckles. "We're not here to talk," Jordan sighed. "Figures." He stopped 5 feet away, adjusting the strap of his backpack. Brandon tilted his head. "You're real good at dodging fights, aren't you?" Jordan met his gaze evenly. "I don't fight just because someone wants me to." Brandon's smirk widened. "Well, that's the problem." He stepped forward. "See, Carter, you made me look bad." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "I didn't do anything. You embarrassed yourself." The smirk twitched. Jordan knew that it hit a nerve. Brandon clenched his jaw. "And now I have to fix that." He cracked his knuckles. Nick and Kyle stepped closer. Nick moved first, a quick step forward, swinging at Jordan's ribs. Jordan reacted instantly. A sidestep. A smooth pivot. Nick's fist hit nothing but air. Kyle followed, grabbing at Jordan's shirt. Jordan twisted away, slapping Kyle's arm aside. Fluid. Controlled. Brandon's eyes narrowed. Jordan could see it. He wasn't expecting Jordan to handle this so effortlessly. But he wasn't done yet. Brandon let out an irritated breath. He was used to being in control. He was used to people breaking under pressure. Jordan wasn't breaking. So Brandon changed tactics. He nodded at one of his guys, who suddenly rushed at Jordan from behind. Jordan heard the scuff of sneakers on pavement and pivoted just in time. A hard shoulder slammed into him, knocking him back into a parked car. Pain shot through his side. The guy tried to grab him, but Jordan dropped low, twisting out of reach. But that moment of distraction was all Brandon needed. A fist flew toward Jordan's face, and this time it connected. Jordan's vision flashed white. The punch had landed just below his eye, sharp pain blooming across his cheek. For a second, the world felt off balance, but then clarity. Jordan had trained for moments like this. Breathe, focus, stay calm. He lifted his gaze to Brandon and he smiled. Brandon's expression flickered, confused. Jordan rolled his shoulders. "That's it." Brandon's smirk returned, but it was forced now. Not even close. He stepped forward. Jordan let him. Brandon swung again, a fast right hook. Jordan moved before it even connected. A step inside the strike. A quick redirect. Brandon's own momentum threw him off balance, and Jordan, he struck. A precise, controlled palm strike to the ribs. Brandon staggered back, gasping. Nick charged next. Jordan pivoted, grabbed Nick's arm, and used his own momentum to flip him onto the pavement. Kyle hesitated. He had seen enough. Jordan stood tall, calm, ready. Brandon gritted his teeth, but he knew he had lost. A hush had fallen over the parking lot. The scattered students who had been watching weren't laughing anymore. Brandon pushed himself up, breathing heavily. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Jordan wiped his mouth, ignoring the sting where he had been punched. "Are we done?" Brandon's fists clenched. But he didn't step forward. Nick groaned from the ground. Kyle backed up slightly. And then Brandon did something unexpected. He laughed. A short, bitter chuckle. Then he turned and walked away. Nick scrambled up, following. Kyle hesitated, then did the same. Just like that, it was over. Jordan watched them go. His hands were still steady, his breathing even. He hadn't just won the fight, he had ended the war. Jordan picked up his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder. Behind him, he heard someone step closer. It was Ethan. His roommate looked stunned. "Dude," Jordan exhaled. "Yeah," Ethan shook his head. "That was," he searched for the words. "Insane." Jordan smiled slightly. "I've seen worse." Ethan hesitated. "So what happens now?" Jordan shrugged. Now, he glanced at the fading figures of Brandon and his crew. "Now, we see if they learned their lesson." By the time Jordan Carter stepped onto Riverside Academy's campus Monday morning, he could feel the shift. It was subtle. No more whispered insults in the hallway, no more casual shoulder bumps meant to test him. Instead, people were watching him differently. Some with curiosity, some with cautious respect, and some with fear. It was the same feeling he had experienced at other schools after a fight. A single moment of self-defense had changed everything. But this wasn't just any school. This was Riverside, and Brandon Hale wasn't just any bully. The fight in the parking lot had broken an unspoken rule. Jordan hadn't just fought back, he had won. That meant something here. That changed things, and not always for the better. Jordan walked down the hallway toward his first period class, feeling the weight of his own footsteps. Locker doors shut quietly when he passed. Students who had ignored him before now watched with wide eyes. Some whispered, others simply stepped out of his way. It wasn't hostile, exactly. But it wasn't normal either. He had expected some attention, but not this. As he reached his locker, Ethan, his roommate, suddenly appeared beside him. "Dude," Ethan muttered, glancing around before leaning in. "What did you do to these people?" Jordan smirked, unlocking his locker. "I existed," Ethan huffed. "Nah, man, this is more than that. You turned into a freaking myth over the weekend." Jordan sighed. "It was just a fight," Ethan snorted. "Not according to the rumors." Jordan closed his locker and gave Ethan a look. "Let me guess." "I broke Brandon's arm, sent Nick to the hospital, took down 5 guys single-handedly." Ethan grinned. "Oh, those are just the warm-up stories. My favorite one is that you're some underground MMA fighter who had to transfer schools because you broke too many noses." Jordan shook his head, exhaling. "People love making up stories." Ethan grew serious. "Yeah, and that's the problem." Jordan frowned. "Why?" Ethan hesitated. "Because the bigger the story gets, the harder it is to avoid what happens next." The first real sign of trouble came in English Lit class. Jordan slid into his usual seat, casually glancing across the room. That's when he noticed Brandon wasn't there. His usual spot empty. Jordan wasn't surprised. After getting humiliated in front of half the school, Brandon probably needed time to lick his wounds. But what bothered him was that no one was talking about it. No whispered gossip, no jokes, no questions, just silence, like they were waiting. Jordan tapped his fingers on his desk. Something wasn't right, and he had a feeling he'd find out what soon enough. Lunchtime arrived, and Jordan made his way toward the cafeteria, expecting the usual routine. But the moment he stepped inside, he knew things had changed. The usual background noise dimmed. Students watched him, some with awe, some with fear, and some with hatred. Jordan ignored them, grabbed his tray, and scanned for a place to sit. He caught sight of a group of freshmen whispering excitedly. He didn't recognize them, but he heard the words, "That's him. The guy who took down Hale," Jordan sighed. He kept walking. But then, "He's just another violent thug." The words were sharp, cruel. Jordan's steps slowed, not loud enough to be an open insult, but not soft enough to be ignored. He turned his head slightly. A girl, brunette, expensive jewelry, disgust curling her lips. She looked away quickly when she realized he had heard her. Jordan felt his jaw tighten. This was the other side of the story. Some people saw him as strong. Others, they saw him as a problem. He had been here before, and he knew exactly how this ended. Jordan had barely finished lunch when a voice cut through the cafeteria. "Carter, principal's office, now." The room went silent. Jordan turned to see Mr. Wallace, the vice principal, standing by the door. The way he said Jordan's name, sharp, clipped, like Jordan had already done something wrong. Jordan sighed and stood, of course. It was never going to be that easy. Jordan sat across from Principal Holloway, an older man with silver hair and tired eyes. Mr. Wallace stood beside him, arms crossed. Jordan kept his posture relaxed. He had a feeling they wanted to see him nervous. "Carter," Principal Holloway started. "Do you know why you're here?" Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Because I want a fight I didn't start." Wallace's frown deepened. "Violence is unacceptable at Riverside." Jordan folded his arms. "I didn't throw the first punch." Holloway leaned forward. "But you threw the last one, didn't you?" Jordan didn't flinch. "Self-defense isn't violence," Wallace scoffed. "You broke a student's nose." Jordan tilted his head. "Oh, I thought Brandon was just out sick." Silence. Wallace's jaw tightened. Jordan had them. They weren't here to punish him. They were here to make sure he knew his place. Principal Holloway sighed. "Look, Carter, you're new here, but you need to understand how things work." Jordan's fingers tapped lightly on the armrest. "I understand perfectly." "Do you?" Wallace stepped forward. "Because the people who usually get into fights here, they don't last long." Jordan met his gaze. "Is that a warning?" Wallace smirked. "It's advice." Holloway exhaled. "You're free to go, Carter." Jordan frowned. "That's it." Wallace's smirk widened. "For now." Jordan stood slowly. This was just the beginning. When Jordan returned to his locker, something was waiting for him. A single white envelope tucked into the slats. No name, no markings, just a message. "You shouldn't have embarrassed him. This isn't over." Jordan exhaled slowly. He knew who sent this. Not Brandon. No, this came from someone else. Someone who was still on Brandon's side. Jordan folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. His heartbeat remained steady. He had expected consequences, but he wasn't worried, because he had one thing they didn't: control. And no matter what came next, he wouldn't lose that. Jordan Carter had faced a lot in his life, different schools, different fights, different bullies. But Riverside Academy, this place was different. It wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about control. And after what happened in the parking lot, Jordan knew one thing: Brandon Hale wasn't going to let it go. Not yet. And as Jordan walked through the halls on Wednesday afternoon, he could feel it. The storm was coming. All day, Jordan had noticed the shift. Some students still gave him cautious nods in the hallway. Others avoided eye contact altogether, like he was radioactive. And then there were the ones who watched him too closely. Brandon's loyalists, Nick, Kyle, the rest of his crew, they hadn't tried anything yet. But their stares, they were waiting for something. Jordan knew what that meant. Brandon wasn't done, not by a long shot. It happened after last period. Jordan was heading toward the dorms when he heard a voice behind him. "Carter." Jordan stopped. Slowly he turned. Brandon Hale stood in the middle of the hallway. No smirk, no fake charm, just anger, and behind him, Nick, Kyle, two other guys, a familiar setup. Jordan kept his expression calm. Brandon's jaw clenched. "We're settling this." Jordan sighed. "Haven't we already?" Brandon stepped closer. "You don't get it, do you?" Jordan crossed his arms. "Oh, I get it. You lost, and now you're trying to save face." Brandon's eyes darkened. Parking lot was a warm-up. Nick chuckled behind him. Kyle cracked his knuckles. Brandon nodded toward the gym doors. "Meet me in there, one-on-one, no interruptions." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Why would I waste my time?" Brandon's lips curled. "Because if you don't, this doesn't end." Jordan studied him. Brandon meant it. If he refused, this wouldn't just be about him and Brandon anymore. Brandon would make sure his life at Riverside was hell. Jordan exhaled. He had no choice. The gym was empty when they entered. Dim lights, echoing footsteps. Nick and Kyle stood by the doors, blocking the exit. Jordan dropped his backpack. "Rules." Brandon pulled off his blazer. "No weapons, no outside interference." Jordan rolled his shoulders. "Fine." Brandon stepped forward. "Let's go." Brandon moved first, a quick jab faster than before. Jordan dodged effortlessly. Brandon threw another. Jordan deflected it. Brandon's frustration grew. "Stop running." Jordan smirked. "Then stop missing." Brandon snarled, then lunged. This time Jordan let him get closer. Then a sharp counter strike to Brandon's ribs. Brandon stumbled. Nick and Kyle flinched. Jordan stepped back calm, unshaken. "You done?" Brandon gritted his teeth. "Not even close." Brandon charged again. Wilder, sloppier. Jordan dodged. Brandon swung, missed. Jordan countered a clean strike to the shoulder. Brandon staggered. Nick and Kyle exchanged glances. Brandon was losing again, and he knew it. But then, something changed. Brandon's eyes flickered with something dangerous, and suddenly, he did the unexpected. Instead of throwing another punch, Brandon faked a stumble. Jordan hesitated. And in that split second, Brandon struck. A sharp, underhand punch straight to Jordan's ribs. Jordan gasped, stumbling back. Pain exploded through his side. Brandon smirked. "Didn't see that coming, did you?" Jordan exhaled. It hurt, but it wasn't enough to stop him, not even close. Jordan straightened, his breath steadying. Brandon frowned. He had expected that hit to end things. It didn't. Jordan flexed his fingers, no more playing around. Brandon lunged one last time. Jordan moved fast. A smooth sidestep, a quick pivot, and then the final strike. Jordan's foot snapped forward, a perfect roundhouse kick. Brandon never saw it coming. The impact sent him crashing to the floor. Hard silence. Nick and Kyle stared. Brandon groaned, struggling to sit up. Jordan stepped back. "We done now," Brandon coughed. "Screw you," Jordan sighed. "Thought so." He grabbed his backpack, walked toward the door. Nick moved aside. Kyle hesitated, then followed. As Jordan pushed open the doors, he turned one last time. Brandon was still on the ground, still fuming. But there was something else in his eyes now, something Jordan hadn't seen before. Fear. Outside, Ethan was waiting. His face pale. "Dude," Jordan exhaled. "Yeah," Ethan shook his head. "You just ended him." Jordan didn't smile, didn't gloat, because this wasn't about winning. It was about ending the fight for good, and he had. Jordan Carter woke up to silence. Not the kind that felt heavy or dangerous, but the kind that felt calm, settled, different. For the first time since arriving at Riverside Academy, he felt like he could breathe. No tension, no paranoia, no waiting for the next attack. He sat up, stretching out the soreness in his muscles. His ribs still ached from Brandon's cheap shot, but he didn't mind, because it was over. Brandon had lost, and for once, Jordan didn't feel like he was just surviving. He had won. When Jordan walked into the hallway, he noticed something immediately. The stairs were still there, but they weren't the same. The whispers had changed. People moved aside, but not out of fear. It was something else. Respect. For the first time since coming to Riverside, Jordan wasn't the outsider anymore. He wasn't just the new kid. He was someone who had earned his place. And then there were the ones who avoided him completely. Nick, Kyle, the rest of Brandon's crew, they wouldn't even look at him. That was fine. He didn't need their approval, he just needed peace. By lunchtime, the news had officially spread. Brandon Hale was gone. Not permanently, but long enough for everyone to notice. His father had pulled him out for medical leave. A cover story, obviously. Brandon had lost, and in a school like Riverside, that meant he had lost everything. Jordan wasn't celebrating. He knew guys like Brandon didn't just disappear forever. But for now, he was out of the picture, and that was enough. Jordan was halfway through his lunch when someone sat across from him. He looked up and froze. It wasn't Ethan. It wasn't some random freshman looking for a story. It was Derek Brooks, captain of the basketball team. One of the most respected seniors at Riverside. Someone who, up until now, had never even looked Jordan's way. Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Can I help you?" Derek smirked. "You're an interesting guy, Carter," Jordan sighed. "That's one way to put it." Derek leaned forward. "You ever think about trying out for the team?" Jordan blinked. "Basketball," Derek nodded. "I saw how you moved in that fight." Jordan frowned. "I wasn't fighting for fun," Derek chuckled. "I know, but it wasn't about the fight. It was about how you handled it. You don't lose control. You don't let emotions decide your next move." Jordan tilted his head. "And that makes me a good basketball player," Derek grinned. "That makes you a good leader." Jordan exhaled. A few weeks ago, he wouldn't have considered it. But now, maybe this school didn't have to be a battlefield. Maybe he could actually build something here. He glanced at Derek. "Tryouts are when?" Derek smirked. "Next week." Jordan picked up his fork and took a bite. "I'll think about it," Derek chuckled. "That's all I wanted to hear." And with that, he stood and walked away. Jordan watched him go. A new path, a new choice, a new chapter. For the first time, he wasn't just looking for the next fight. He was looking toward the future. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready for it.